"Sheriff, are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" The words were calm, almost quiet, but they cut through the afternoon air of Redwood Creek like a sudden shift in the wind. It was just after 3:30 p.m., the kind of warm small-town afternoon where the sun hung low over the highway and the scent of gasoline drifted lazily across the cracked asphalt of Miller's Gas and Go. Pickup trucks rolled in and out of the lot, tires crunching over gravel, while the digital price board flickered above the pumps. $3.78 a gallon. Nothing about the scene looked unusual. Nothing looked like the moment a quiet stop for gas would suddenly turn into something everyone in town would be talking about before sunset. Ava Jackson stood beside a dark gray SUV at pump number 4, the nozzle resting in the tank while the digital numbers ticked upward. She looked like any other traveler passing through. Mid-30s, simple navy jacket, dark jeans, hair pulled back neatly. A leather folder rested on the passenger seat of the vehicle, barely visible through the windshield. Her posture was relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the roof of the SUV as she watched the pump climb past 15 gallons. Then the sound came, the low growl of an approaching engine, tires rolling sharply across the lot before stopping sideways near the pump. The Redwood County Sheriff's cruiser cut across the front of the station like a barrier. The driver door opened with a heavy metallic thud. Sheriff Daniel Carter stepped out slowly, the afternoon sun glinting off the silver star pinned to his chest. Carter had worn that badge for nearly 2 decades. In a town like Redwood Creek, population just under 9,000, his word carried the weight of law itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence alone was enough to make most people step back without asking questions. Today was no different. His eyes locked immediately onto the SUV and the woman beside it. Ava noticed him, of course. It was impossible not to. But she didn't move. The pump continued clicking steadily as fuel flowed into the tank. Carter walked forward with deliberate steps, boots scraping against the pavement. 2 men standing near the ice freezer outside the convenience store paused mid-conversation. A teenager leaning against his sedan slowly lifted his phone, curiosity already turning into attention. The sheriff stopped a few feet from the vehicle and looked it over, his expression tightening as if he had already made a decision. "Step away from the vehicle," Carter said firmly, his voice carrying across the lot. Ava blinked once, almost surprised by the sudden command. She gently returned the pump nozzle to its holder and turned toward him. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone even. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the license plate, then back at her. "That SUV was reported stolen about 30 minutes ago outside Riverside Mall," he said. "So I'm going to need you to step away from it. Now." A murmur rippled through the gas station. The teenager's phone lifted higher. Someone near the door of the convenience store stopped walking entirely. Ava looked at the sheriff for a moment, studying him the way someone might examine a complicated puzzle. There was no panic in her eyes. No anger either. Just a quiet patience. "Sheriff," she said calmly, "this vehicle isn't stolen." Carter gave a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny," he replied. "That's exactly what people usually say." He took another step forward, placing one hand on his belt while his gaze swept across the SUV again. "Keys," he said. "On the hood." Ava slowly removed the key fob from her pocket and placed it on the metal surface of the vehicle as requested. Around them, more people had begun drifting closer. A delivery driver who had just stepped out of his truck leaned against the side mirror to watch. Carter picked up the key fob and examined it briefly before pressing the unlock button. The SUV lights blinked once in response. "Well," he said under his breath, "isn't that interesting?" Ava folded her arms loosely, standing beside the pump as if she had nowhere else she needed to be. The sun reflected softly off the windshield. Somewhere down the highway a semi-truck thundered past. Carter looked back at her again, suspicion sharpening his expression. "Mind explaining why you're driving a vehicle that matches the exact description of a stolen one?" he asked. Ava tilted her head slightly. "Because it's mine," she said simply. Carter stared at her for a long moment. The silence around the gas station grew heavier, filled only by the hum of engines and the faint clicking of cooling metal from nearby cars. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "I don't think so." Then he reached toward the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch," he said, voice firm and controlled. "I've got the suspected vehicle at Miller's Gas and Go." Ava watched him speak into the radio without interrupting. A few people in the crowd whispered quietly. Someone's phone camera zoomed in closer. When Carter finished the call, he looked back at her and gestured toward the open space beside the pump. "Hands where I can see them," he said. Ava raised her hand slightly, not in fear, but in compliance. Her expression never changed. For a moment the sheriff seemed almost irritated by how calm she remained. That was when she spoke again, her voice steady enough that even the people filming seemed to lean in to hear it. "Sheriff," she said, meeting his eyes without hesitation, "are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Carter frowned. "Lady," he replied, "you don't get to ask questions here." Ava gave the faintest nod, as if acknowledging something only she understood. In the distance, far down the road beyond the gas station sign, the faint shape of 3 dark SUVs began moving toward the intersection. But no one in the parking lot noticed them yet. Not the crowd, not the man filming, and certainly not Sheriff Daniel Carter. The sheriff's cruiser door remained open as Daniel Carter leaned slightly inside, one hand resting on the roof while he spoke quietly into the radio again, his voice lower now but still edged with certainty. From across the gas station, Lot Ava Jackson watched him without moving, her calm posture unchanged despite the growing attention surrounding them. The afternoon sun had begun to dip a little lower, casting longer shadows across the pavement and turning the chrome edges of the gas pumps into small flashes of reflected light. The crowd had grown to nearly a dozen people now, some pretending to check their vehicles, while others openly observing the scene unfolding beside pump number 4. The teenager who had been filming earlier had now stepped behind a red pickup truck, still recording but trying to remain unnoticed. Ava noticed everything. She noticed the whispering voices, the curious stares, and the slow tension that often builds when people sense something unusual happening in a normally quiet town. But her attention kept drifting back toward the highway. Far beyond the station sign, the 3 dark vehicles had moved closer. Again, still traveling steadily along the road toward the intersection. Sheriff Carter stepped back out from the cruiser and closed the door with a firm push. He walked toward Ava again, his expression more serious now, the confidence in his posture slightly tighter than before. "Dispatch is checking the vehicle identification number," he said as he approached, speaking loud enough that several of the nearby onlookers could hear him. "Until that comes back, you are not going anywhere." Ava gave a small nod. "I was not planning to leave." Carter studied her face for a moment, as if searching for a hint of nervousness. Instead, he found the same quiet composure that had been there from the beginning. It seemed to irritate him more than open resistance might have. "You are very calm for someone being questioned about a stolen vehicle," he said. Ava allowed herself the faintest smile. "I am calm because I know the truth usually has a way of catching up." A man near the convenience store door muttered softly to the woman beside him that the sheriff looked like he did not appreciate that answer. Carter folded his arms briefly and glanced again toward the SUV, then back at Ava. "You said something earlier," he said slowly, "about a federal program." Ava nodded once. "That is correct. What exactly does that mean?" Carter asked. Ava took a breath, the warm afternoon air moving gently across the station lot. "It means the vehicle is part of a government-registered fleet." Carter frowned again, clearly not satisfied. "That is a very convenient explanation," he replied. Ava did not argue. Instead, she looked past him toward the road for a brief moment before returning her gaze to his face. "Sheriff," she said calmly, "may I ask you a question?" Carter hesitated but gestured slightly with his hand. "Go ahead." Ava's voice remained steady. "How long have you been the sheriff of Redwood County?" The question caught him off guard for a moment. 17 years, he said after a second. "Why?" Ava nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the number. "That is a long time to wear a badge," she said. "Long enough to know that situations are not always what they appear to be." Carter shifted his weight, the statement clearly not landing the way she intended. "I know exactly what I am looking at," he replied firmly. Ava did not challenge him. Instead, she looked briefly toward the horizon again, where the 3 approaching SUVs had now turned off the highway and onto the narrow road leading toward the gas station. The vehicles moved quietly but with purpose, closing the final half-mile between the highway and Miller's Gas and Go. The rumble of their engines had not yet reached the crowd gathered near the pumps, but Ava seemed aware of them in a way no one else was. Sheriff Carter noticed her glance toward the road and followed it with his eyes, though at that distance the vehicles still looked like nothing more than ordinary traffic approaching the station. He looked back at her again. "Expecting someone?" he asked. Ava met his gaze calmly. "Eventually," she said. The distant hum of approaching engines slowly blended into the quiet afternoon atmosphere of Miller's Gas and Go, though most of the people gathered near the pumps had not yet noticed it. Sheriff Daniel Carter remained focused on the woman standing beside the gray SUV, his posture rigid with the quiet certainty of a man used to being the final authority in every situation he encountered. Ava Jackson, however, continued to stand exactly where she had been since the moment he arrived, calm and unhurried, as if time itself had slowed around her. The faint breeze stirred dust along the edge of the parking lot, while the sign above the gas station flickered softly in the sunlight. Carter narrowed his eyes slightly as he studied her expression again. There was something about the way she carried herself that did not match the situation he believed he was dealing with. Most people questioned by the sheriff in a small town like Redwood Creek either became defensive or nervous within seconds. Ava did neither. She simply waited. The radio on Carter's shoulder suddenly crackled again, cutting through the quiet murmur of the small crowd. He lifted it quickly, pressing the button with practiced ease. Dispatch spoke through the static, their voice steady but slightly uncertain this time as they read back new information regarding the vehicle identification number he had provided moments earlier. Carter listened carefully, his face tightening as the dispatcher continued speaking. The confirmation they had expected did not come as clearly as he had anticipated. Instead, there were questions about federal registration records and a notation that the vehicle appeared inside a government fleet database. Carter released the radio slowly and clipped it back onto his shoulder. For a brief moment, the confidence in his expression faltered before returning again, though now there was a subtle tension beneath it. Several people nearby leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift even if they could not hear the details of the call. Ava watched him quietly. "Did dispatch find something interesting?" she asked gently. Carter did not answer immediately. Instead, he took 2 slow steps toward the SUV again, looking over the hood and along the side panels as though the vehicle itself might reveal some hidden truth if he stared at it long enough. "Records are not always accurate," he said finally. Ava nodded once. "That is true." The sheriff turned back toward her. "You said earlier that this vehicle came from a federal fleet program." Ava met his gaze. "Yes." Carter studied her again, this time with a deeper scrutiny. "You mind explaining what exactly that means?" Ava paused for a moment before answering, her voice still measured and calm. "It means this vehicle is assigned through a federal agency." The words hung quietly in the warm air between them. One of the bystanders whispered something to the person beside him, while another man shifted his weight near the entrance of the convenience store. Carter crossed his arms again, the silver star on his chest catching a brief flash of sunlight. "Federal agency," he repeated slowly. "That sounds like a very broad explanation." Ava did not appear offended. Instead, she glanced briefly toward the narrow road leading into the station. The 3 dark SUVs had now reached the final stretch of pavement just beyond the property line, their dark windows reflecting the late afternoon sky as they approached the entrance of the lot. The sound of their engines finally became noticeable, though most of the crowd had not yet realized what it meant. Carter noticed Ava's brief glance again. "You keep looking at that road," he said. "Should I expect someone to show up?" Ava returned her attention to him. "You asked me earlier if I was expecting someone," she said quietly. Carter waited. Ava's expression remained steady, almost thoughtful. "Sometimes," she continued, "the truth arrives exactly when it is supposed to." At that moment, the first of the dark SUVs turned into the gas station lot, followed closely by the other 2 vehicles. Their arrival was smooth and controlled, tires rolling slowly across the pavement before coming to a stop several yards behind the sheriff's patrol car. The sudden appearance of the 3 vehicles drew the attention of nearly everyone standing nearby. Conversation stopped. Phones lifted slightly higher. Sheriff Carter turned toward the sound, his expression tightening as the doors of the first SUV opened and several figures stepped out wearing dark suits that moved with the quiet confidence of people who were accustomed to being taken seriously the moment they entered a room. For the first time since the encounter began, the atmosphere in the small gas station lot shifted completely, the quiet tension transforming into something far heavier as Ava Jackson watched the new arrivals with the calm recognition of someone who had been expecting them all along. The gas station lot fell into an uneasy silence as the three dark SUVs rolled to a controlled stop behind Sheriff Carter's patrol vehicle. Their engines hummed softly for a moment before shutting off one by one, leaving the warm afternoon air strangely still. The crowd that had gathered near the pumps instinctively shifted a few steps backward, the quiet curiosity in their faces now mixed with uncertainty. In a town like Redwood Creek, unfamiliar vehicles arriving in formation usually meant something serious. The doors of the first SUV opened with a smooth mechanical click, and two men stepped out wearing dark suits and crisp white shirts. Their movements were calm but deliberate, the kind of posture that suggested they were accustomed to walking into tense situations without hesitation. A third person emerged from the second vehicle, carrying a slim black folder under his arm. None of them looked toward the crowd. Their attention moved directly toward the center of the parking lot, where Sheriff Carter and Ava Jackson stood beside the gray SUV at pump number 4. Carter's shoulders tightened as he watched them approach. For a brief moment, he seemed unsure whether to step forward or remain exactly where he was. The authority he carried in Redwood County usually meant people came to him with questions. This time it felt different. The lead man in the dark suit walked several steps closer before stopping a short distance from Carter. His expression was calm but serious, his eyes scanning the scene quickly before settling on Ava. The faintest nod passed between them, subtle enough that most of the onlookers did not notice it. Ava returned the nod with equal restraint. Carter noticed it immediately. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" the sheriff asked, his voice steady though his posture had grown noticeably rigid. The man holding the black folder opened it slowly, revealing a small identification wallet which he held briefly at chest level. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," he said in a clear professional tone. "My name is Michael Reynolds." Carter looked at the identification for only a second before his eyes shifted back to the man's face. The three letters printed beneath the seal were unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words seemed to hang in the quiet air of the gas station lot like the sudden arrival of a storm cloud. A low murmur moved through the crowd as several people leaned forward to see better. Carter's expression hardened slightly, though a flicker of surprise passed through his eyes before he controlled it. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he repeated slowly. "That is interesting." Reynolds closed the identification wallet and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. "We were in the area," he said calmly, "and it appears we arrived just in time." Carter folded his arms again, his voice measured but guarded. "In time for what exactly?" Reynolds turned his head slightly toward Ava before answering. "In time to assist Agent Jackson." The words landed with quiet precision. For a brief second, the entire parking lot seemed to stop moving. Even the teenager filming behind the pickup truck lowered his phone slightly, as if he was not sure he had heard correctly. Sheriff Carter stared at Reynolds, then slowly turned his head toward Ava. "Agent Jackson," he repeated. Ava met his gaze without hostility, but with the same calm certainty she had carried since the moment the encounter began. "Yes," she said quietly. Carter looked from her to the gray SUV, then back toward the group of federal agents standing behind Reynolds. The pieces of the situation that had seemed so simple 20 minutes earlier now felt far less certain. Reynolds spoke again, his voice polite but unmistakably firm. "Sheriff, we received confirmation that Agent Jackson's vehicle was flagged during your dispatch inquiry. That is why we came directly here." Carter inhaled slowly, his jaw tightening slightly. "Dispatch mentioned something about federal registration," he admitted. Reynolds nodded once. "That is correct." He glanced briefly toward the SUV before continuing. "The vehicle belongs to the Bureau and is assigned to Agent Jackson during an active investigation." Carter's eyes narrowed slightly as the meaning behind that statement began to settle into place. Around them, the bystanders had fallen almost completely silent now, their earlier curiosity replaced by the quiet tension of witnessing something far bigger than a routine traffic dispute. Ava Jackson remained standing beside the pump, hands relaxed at her sides, watching the sheriff carefully as the truth that had been approaching all afternoon finally arrived in the center of the gas station lot. For several long seconds, Sheriff Daniel Carter did not speak. The quiet weight of the moment settled over Miller's gas and go like the sudden drop in pressure before a summer storm. Cars continued passing along the highway a few hundred yards away, But inside the small parking lot, everything had slowed to an almost uncomfortable stillness. Carter looked from Agent Michael Reynolds to Ava Jackson again, as if trying to rearrange the facts in front of him into something that made sense. Just minutes earlier, he had been completely certain about the situation. A suspected stolen vehicle. A routine stop. Another afternoon enforcing the law in a town where people rarely questioned his authority. Now the same moment looked very different. Agent Jackson, Carter repeated quietly, the words sounding unfamiliar in his mouth. Ava gave a small nod. That is correct, Sheriff. The bystanders standing near the convenience store shifted slightly, several of them whispering under their breath. The teenager who had been filming raised his phone again, now holding it more carefully, as if he understood that the scene unfolding in front of him had suddenly become far more important than he first realized. Agent Reynolds remained calm, his posture relaxed but unmistakably confident. Sheriff Carter, he said politely, this appears to be a misunderstanding involving a vehicle that belongs to the Bureau. Carter exhaled slowly through his nose. Dispatch mentioned something about federal records, he admitted. But a vehicle matching this description was reported stolen earlier today. Reynolds nodded slightly, as if he had expected that explanation. We are aware of the report, he said. It came from a private security office that misidentified the vehicle during a routine check in a shopping center parking lot. Carter's brow tightened. So you are saying the report was incorrect? That is exactly what I am saying, Reynolds replied calmly. The sheriff glanced toward the gray SUV again. In the sunlight, the vehicle looked completely ordinary, just another sport utility vehicle that might pass through any highway town in America. Yet the context around it had shifted entirely. Carter's attention returned to Ava. You could have told me this earlier, he said, his tone measured but clearly strained. Ava held his gaze without raising her voice. Sheriff, I tried to explain that the vehicle was part of a federal fleet. Carter said nothing for a moment. A faint breeze moved across the station lot again, rustling the paper receipts hanging from the pumps. Somewhere behind the crowd, a car door closed with a dull thump. Reynolds stepped slightly closer, his voice still professional, but now carrying a more direct edge. Agent Jackson is assigned to an active federal investigation, he said. Carter's eyes narrowed again. An investigation involving Redwood County? He asked. Reynolds did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked briefly toward Ava before returning his attention to the sheriff. The details of that investigation are not something we are prepared to discuss in a public parking lot, he said evenly. The statement hung heavily in the air. Several of the bystanders exchanged quick glances, clearly aware that the situation had moved far beyond the simple vehicle dispute they had first witnessed. Carter shifted his weight slightly, the badge on his chest catching the sunlight again. For the first time since the encounter began, the certainty that had defined his posture earlier seemed less absolute. If there is a federal investigation happening in my county, he said slowly, I would expect to be informed. Ava spoke before Reynolds could respond. Sheriff, she said gently, sometimes investigations require a little patience. Carter looked at her sharply, but there was no challenge in her tone. Only calm, only quiet confidence. The same confidence she had shown since the beginning of the encounter. Reynolds adjusted the cuff of his jacket and glanced briefly at the small crowd that had gathered around the gas station. Perhaps this conversation would be more productive somewhere with fewer spectators, he suggested. Carter followed his gaze toward the onlookers. Nearly a dozen people were watching now, their attention fixed completely on the scene unfolding beside pump number 4. Some held phones. Others simply stood, still, waiting to see what would happen next. The sheriff turned back toward Ava one more time. You have caused quite a scene here today, he said. Ava looked around the parking lot quietly before answering. Sheriff, she replied. Sometimes the truth arrives in front of witnesses for a reason. The words were not loud, but they carried across the silent gas station lot with unmistakable clarity. The late afternoon sun had begun sliding lower toward the horizon, casting a golden glow across the quiet highway outside Redwood Creek. Inside the parking lot of Miller's Gas and Go, however, the atmosphere felt heavier with every passing second. Sheriff Daniel Carter stood beside his patrol vehicle, the silver star on his chest catching the fading light as he looked from Agent Michael Reynolds to Ava Jackson again. The earlier certainty in his posture had softened into something more cautious, as if the ground beneath the situation had shifted and he had not yet decided where to place his next step. Around them, the small group of bystanders remained frozen in place. Some people pretended to check their vehicles while secretly listening to every word. Others stood openly with phones raised, documenting a moment that had clearly grown larger than anyone expected when the sheriff first arrived at pump number 4. Agent Reynolds kept his voice steady and professional as he spoke again. "Sheriff Carter, the situation involving the vehicle has already been clarified," he said calmly. "However, there is another matter we need to address." Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. "Another matter," he repeated. Ava remained quiet beside the SUV, watching the exchange with the same composed expression she had carried from the beginning. Reynolds gave a small nod before continuing. "Agent Jackson was not simply traveling through Redwood County today," he said. "She was already here on official business." Carter folded his arms slowly, the movement deliberate. "Official business involving my county?" he asked. Reynolds paused for a moment before answering. "Yes." The word hung quietly in the air. A pickup truck passing along the highway sent a faint rumble across the pavement before disappearing down the road, but inside the gas station lot the silence remained thick. Carter shifted his gaze toward Ava again. "You never mentioned that," he said. Ava met his eyes calmly. "You did not ask." The sheriff let out a slow breath, clearly weighing the implications. "If there is an investigation taking place in Redwood County," he said carefully, "then I should have been notified." Reynolds remained polite but firm. "Sheriff, there are situations where advance notification can compromise an investigation." Carter did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the crowd that had gathered near the convenience store entrance. Nearly every pair of eyes was still fixed on the scene unfolding in the center of the lot. When he looked back at Reynolds, his voice was slightly lower. "You are saying that the investigation involves someone inside my jurisdiction." Reynolds did not confirm or deny the statement directly. "We are saying that Agent Jackson has been working quietly in this region for the past several weeks," he explained. Carter's expression tightened slightly. Ava spoke again before the silence could stretch further. "Sheriff, Redwood County has recently reported several unusual vehicle seizures tied to property disputes," she said calmly. Carter looked at her sharply. "Those were lawful asset holds," he replied quickly. Ava did not challenge the statement directly. "Perhaps," she said, "but federal auditors have been reviewing the paperwork connected to those cases." A few of the bystanders exchanged confused glances, clearly not following the full meaning of the conversation, but sensing that the topic had become far more serious than a misunderstanding about a stolen vehicle. Carter's jaw tightened again. "Are you suggesting something improper happened under my office?" Ava shook her head slightly. "I am saying that questions were raised." Reynolds stepped forward just enough to shift the attention back toward him. "Sheriff Carter, the purpose of today's visit was not to create a confrontation," he said evenly. "Agent Jackson's presence here was part of a routine fact-gathering process." Carter glanced once more toward the SUV, then toward the dark vehicles parked behind his cruiser, and finally back to Ava. The weight of the moment had changed the entire balance of the encounter. Just 20 minutes earlier, he had been the unquestioned authority in the parking lot. Now the situation felt far more complicated. Ava watched him quietly, then spoke one final time. "Sheriff," she said gently, "sometimes investigations begin with small misunderstandings." The fading sunlight stretched across the pavement as the crowd waited silently, aware that the simple stop at a gas station had turned into something far more significant than anyone in Redwood Creek would forget anytime soon. The golden light of the late afternoon had begun to fade into a deeper amber as the sun dropped closer to the horizon beyond Redwood Creek. The long shadows stretching across the parking lot of Miller's Gas and Go made the small gathering of people appear almost frozen in time. Sheriff Daniel Carter stood beside his patrol car with his arms loosely folded, but the posture no longer carried the same unquestioned confidence it had earlier. Across from him, Ava Jackson remained calm beside the gray SUV, her composure unchanged despite the weight of the conversation that had unfolded in front of a growing audience. Agent Michael Reynolds stepped slightly to the side, glancing briefly toward the convenience store windows where reflections of the entire scene shimmered faintly in the glass. The murmurs from the bystanders had quieted into near silence, the crowd sensing that something important was about to be said. Reynolds turned back toward the sheriff and spoke with the careful clarity of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information. "Sheriff Carter," he said evenly, "the questions Agent Jackson mentioned earlier are part of a broader review currently being conducted by federal oversight offices." Carter's eyes narrowed again, though his voice remained controlled. "Oversight of what exactly?" he asked. Reynolds did not rush his answer. "Several recent asset seizure reports filed through the Redwood County Sheriff's Department," he said. Carter shifted his weight slightly, the badge on his chest reflecting a dim flash of sunlight. "Those cases followed proper procedure," he said firmly. Ava watched him quietly before speaking again. "Sheriff, the procedures themselves are not what raised the concern," she said. Carter turned toward her. "Then what did?" Ava glanced briefly toward the gray SUV, then back to the sheriff. "The pattern." The words settled into the quiet air like a pebble dropped into still water. Reynolds continued calmly. "Over the past 8 months, several vehicles were temporarily seized under civil asset review, claims tied to ongoing investigations," he explained. However, federal auditors noticed something unusual about the timing and locations connected to those reports. Carter's jaw tightened slightly. "Unusual in what way?" he asked. Ava answered before Reynolds could respond. "Most of the seizures occurred along the same stretch of highway just outside Redwood Creek," she said. "And nearly every one involved drivers who were simply passing through the county." Carter looked from her to Reynolds again. "You are suggesting that my department has been targeting travelers?" he asked. Ava did not raise her voice. "I am saying the data raised that possibility." The sheriff glanced briefly toward the watching crowd, clearly aware that every word was now being heard by half the gas station parking lot. His voice dropped slightly lower. "That is a serious accusation." Reynolds remained calm. "At this stage it is not an accusation," he said. "It is a review." Carter stared at him for a long moment before turning his attention back to Ava. "And you came here personally to look into this?" he asked. Ava nodded once. Quietly, she said. The fading sunlight painted the sky behind the gas station in soft shades of orange and purple. The 3 dark SUVs parked behind the sheriff's cruiser now looked almost silhouetted against the dimming light, their presence reminding everyone in the parking lot that the situation had moved far beyond a misunderstanding about a vehicle. Carter let out a slow breath as if measuring the weight of the moment. "You could have contacted my office directly," he said. Ava met his gaze calmly. "Sometimes the most accurate information appears when people do not realize they are being observed," she replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of tires rolling across the highway drifted through the air before fading again. Reynolds finally stepped forward slightly, his tone still professional, but now carrying a quiet finality. "Sheriff Carter," he said, "the review process will continue through official channels over the next several weeks." Carter looked at him carefully. "Meaning what?" Reynolds gestured subtly toward the gray SUV. "Meaning that today's situation was never about a stolen vehicle." Ava spoke softly beside him. "It was about seeing how quickly assumptions can turn into actions." Carter's eyes moved slowly from the federal agents to the crowd that had witnessed the entire encounter. The small gas station lot remained silent as the truth of the afternoon settled in, heavier than anyone present had expected when the sheriff first pulled into Miller's Gas and Go. The last light of the day settled over Redwood Creek as the sun finally dipped behind the distant hills, leaving the sky painted in deep shades of orange and violet. The parking lot of Miller's Gas and Go remained quiet, the earlier murmurs from the small crowd fading into a thoughtful silence as the reality of the afternoon slowly sank in. Sheriff Daniel Carter stood near the front of his patrol vehicle, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but steady in a different way now, as though the weight of everything that had just happened was settling into place. Across from him, Ava Jackson rested one hand lightly on the roof of the gray SUV, the same vehicle that had started the entire confrontation. The faint ticking sound of the cooling engine mixed with the hum of the gas station lights as they flickered on one by one above the pumps. Agent Michael Reynolds and the other federal agents stood a few steps behind her, their presence calm but unmistakable. Carter looked toward the crowd briefly, noticing the faces that had watched the entire exchange from beginning to end. Some people had already lowered their phones. Others stood quietly with expressions that were harder to read now. Curiosity replaced by reflection. The sheriff slowly turned back toward Ava. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he took a slow breath. "Agent Jackson," he said finally, his voice quieter than it had been earlier in the afternoon. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. "Sheriff Carter." The pause between them carried none of the tension from before. Instead, it felt like the calm that follows a storm once the wind has finally passed. Carter glanced once more at the gray SUV, then toward the three dark federal vehicles parked behind his cruiser. "You said earlier that sometimes the truth arrives in front of witnesses for a reason," he said. Ava nodded slightly. "Yes." Carter looked toward the bystanders again, the fading daylight reflecting off the windows of the convenience store behind them. "I suppose today proved that point." Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the quiet town around them for a moment. Redwood Creek was the kind of place where people believed they understood how the world worked. A sheriff's badge meant authority. A stop at a gas station meant a simple pause in the middle of a long drive. But sometimes even ordinary places became the setting for lessons that no one expected. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same steady calm it had held from the beginning. "Power can be a useful thing, Sheriff," she said, "but only when it is guided by patience." Carter absorbed the words silently. The faint sound of crickets had begun drifting across the fields beyond the highway, signaling that evening had fully arrived. A pickup truck rolled slowly into the gas station lot, its driver hesitating for a moment after noticing the cluster of vehicles and people before quietly choosing a pump farther away. Life in Redwood Creek was beginning to return to its normal rhythm again. Agent Reynolds stepped forward slightly, glancing toward Ava as if to signal that it was time to leave. She gave a small nod in response. Carter watched the exchange. "I assume the investigation will continue," he said. Reynolds answered calmly. "Through the appropriate channels." Carter nodded once, accepting the answer even though it left many questions unspoken. Ava walked toward the driver's side of the gray SUV, her footsteps quiet against the pavement. Before opening the door, she paused and looked back toward the sheriff one last time. The crowd remained silent, listening. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear in the evening air. "The law is strongest when it protects everyone equally." Carter held her gaze. For a moment, the only sound in the parking lot was the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Then he gave a small nod, not as a man surrendering authority, but as someone acknowledging a truth that had arrived in front of him when he least expected it. Ava opened the door of the SUV and slid into the driver's seat. One by one, the federal agents returned to their vehicles behind her. Engines started quietly. The gray SUV pulled away from pump number 4 and rolled slowly toward the road, followed by the three dark vehicles. As the convoy disappeared down the highway, the parking lot of Miller's Gas and Go slowly returned to the quiet routine of a small American town. But the people who had witnessed the encounter that afternoon would remember it for a long time.